Everyone, it's so good to see all of you again. Please open up your Bibles to Joshua chapter 1. We're going to be in the book of Joshua this evening. This morning, though, Micah scolded me, and he said, "Now, Gabe, you've got to stop bringing this Tampa heat up to North Carolina." So I'm going to see if maybe when I go, I can bring the heat with me so it can cool down here. One particular hobby of mine that I enjoy is cooking, and I like to, cook several meals. And something that happens is that you'll go on YouTube and you'll watch somebody making something to eat and to prepare, and then what enters into your mind is you think, well, I can make that. And it just so happened that one time I was on YouTube and I saw this. I saw a video about this sandwich that had apparently won the Best Sandwich in the World award, which apparently is a reward that they issue out every year. It's the best sandwich in the world. And the one that had won was the sandwich from India called the Vada Pav. And it's basically like a potato sandwich of some sort. And when I saw it, I thought, well, that can't be too hard. It's just some potatoes that they fry up and some bread. And so I started getting stuff to make it that I had in my house, and I realized, wait, I'm missing some ingredients. So I drove down to the grocery store and I got some more. And then I realized, no, I need to order this as well. And before I knew it, before I counted how much it would cost me to actually make the sandwich and the time that it would take to prepare everything, I thought, this is one of those things that when you go to a restaurant, that's what you're going to buy. And so instead of buying it, instead of making it, I decided that one day I'm just going to buy it. And what had happened is I saw something that I wanted to make, but I was not prepared to do it to make it at all. And perhaps sometimes that's happened with you. Maybe not with food, but perhaps with the decision that you've made. It was just kind of a spur of the moment thing, and after a while you realize, well, you're not really that prepared to do it. It took time to prepare and to have everything come out the way that it's supposed to. As the saying goes, good things take time and preparation. Now, the reason why I bring this up is if we go to the book of Joshua, Joshua needed to prepare for his life's greatest work. Because if you think about who Joshua is and his life, there's some big shoes that Joshua has to fill. And if we go to Joshua chapter 1 and in verse 1, I'll just read for you the first 4 verses of Joshua 1. And let's just set the context of what is going on in Joshua's life at this point. And it says this: "After Moses, the Lord's servant, died, the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, 'Moses, my servant, is dead. Get ready, cross the Jordan, lead these people into the land that I am ready to hand over to them. I am handing over to you every place you set foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert in the south to Lebanon in the north. I will extend all the way to the great river Euphrates in the east, including all Syria, and all the way to the Mediterranean in the west.'" And so here we see that Moses, who so often the prophets and the kings of Israel, they look back and they talk about Moses, this great leader who was able to lead the Israelites out of Egyptian captivity and right to the border of the promised land. But of course, Moses was not allowed to enter because of what he had done. And so Moses dies, and now leadership has passed from Moses to Joshua. Joshua is the one who will now lead the Israelites into the promised land. But notice what it says in verse 2, what God tells Joshua. He says, "Moses, my servant, is dead." And then God tells Joshua, "Get ready." Joshua now has to prepare for this great task ahead. Joshua is going to lead the children of Israel to conquer the land of Canaan, the promised land. And one way that Joshua is going to begin this is the first city that he's going to conquer is the city of Jericho. Now, Jericho is a very significant city in the land of Canaan because Jericho is among the strongest cities in the borders of this land. And many of us know the story of the fall of Jericho, or at least we have heard it and it's been told to us as children. It says that the walls of Jericho fell down after the Israelites had marched around the city once a day for 6 days, 7 times for 6 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day, with the priests blowing their horns daily, and the people shouting on the very last day. And as they shout, the walls come tumbling down, and Jericho falls. And so here's what I'd like us to do. I'd like us to look at some moments leading up to the conquest of Jericho and see what is Joshua doing to get ready for this very important moment. Because Joshua can't just immediately go and take the city. Now, it may have been possible that he had the manpower and the weaponry to do it. But there's more that has to be done both for Joshua and for the children of Israel. There's some hard stuff, some internal things that have to change and to prepare for before they're able to do this. And so what I'd like us to see is just how God is preparing Joshua for the conquest of the land of the city of Jericho. And what we see is in the first 5 chapters of the book of Joshua, God is preparing him to do this. And one thing that I'd like us to keep in mind as we're looking through this lesson is this question that Joshua asks someone. And it's a question that Joshua himself is going to have to answer. And it's this one: whose side are you on? This question is important, and I promise we'll get to it as we study the book of Joshua. But the events in these chapters are important. They set the stage for the very conquest of Jericho and for the conquest of the rest of the promised land. And so let's start with chapter 1 and look at some words that God had for Joshua. And the first thing that I see here is there's some reassurance that has to happen here. Because if you imagine yourself, how must Joshua feel having been Moses' assistant all his life, and now he has to be the one to lead the promised land? Well, that can be intimidating, that can be scary. And so one thing that God does is God is preparing Joshua. And one thing that God does is he gives Joshua confidence, or he gives him reassurance. And so let's keep reading. Let's read verses 5 to 9 now, where it says this. This is God speaking to Joshua. No one will be able to resist you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not abandon you or leave you alone. Be strong and brave. You must lead these people in the conquest of this land that I solemnly promised their ancestors I would hand over to them. And so you just think of just how Joshua must be feeling at this moment. How are things going to be different between me and the Lord? What's going to happen? And God reassures him. I was with Moses. I'm going to be with you, Joshua. What I need from you in this moment is to be strong, to be brave. And then God reminds Joshua, this is a promise that I have made, not just to this generation, but to all your ancestors before you. Let's keep reading. Verse 7. Make sure that you are very strong and brave. Carefully obey all the law that my servant Moses charged you to keep. Do not swerve from it to the right or to the left, so that you may be successful in all you do. This law scroll must not leave your lips. You must memorize it day and night, so that you can carefully obey all that is written in it. Then you will prosper and be successful. I repeat, be strong and brave. Do not be afraid and do not panic. For I, the Lord your God, am with you in all you do. I imagine that those are some words that Joshua really needed to hear in this moment as he's about to do all these great and amazing things. God assures Joshua he is going to be with him. But what is it that Joshua has to do in the meantime? Joshua has to be faithful. He has to be faithful to God's law. Because as we studied in some of my previous lessons, God's law is a beautiful thing, and God did not design the law just arbitrarily because he felt like imposing these rules on the people, but because God's laws were good, that they would help the people. And God is telling Joshua that very same thing. Memorize this law day in and day out, and be strong and be brave. Because as Joshua is thinking of the words of God, imagine that'd be very reassuring for him as he's about to do all of this. And this pays off. Joshua takes action. And so let's keep reading. Verses 10 and 11, it says this: Joshua instructed the leaders of the people. So these are all the heads of all the families, of all the tribes. And then verse 11 he says, "Go through the camp and command the people, prepare your supplies, for within 3 days you will cross the Jordan River and begin the conquest of the land the Lord your God is ready to hand over to you." And so God promises Joshua that if he obeys his commandments, he would achieve success. And what does Joshua do? Joshua immediately begins to get to work. And he tells all the families, prepare. The time has come to take what the Lord has promised us to do. Now, God also reassures Joshua. Now, the emphasis in Scripture has always been on the words of God, and that the words are important. But one thing that God did in the Old Testament and the New is that he would give to a messenger some proof or some evidence so that people would be assured that this message indeed was coming from the Lord. And that's what happens here. God gives Joshua evidence. And so let's begin reading. Let's jump ahead to chapter 3, of Joshua chapter 3. And then we see here, Joshua chapter 3, I'll begin reading in verse 1. Joshua 3, verse 1. Bright and early the next morning, Joshua and the Israelites left and came to the Jordan. They camped there before crossing the river. After 3 days, the leaders went through the camp and commanded the people, "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, you must leave here and walk behind it. But stay about 3,000 feet behind you. Keep your distance so you can see which way you should go, for you have not traveled this way before." Verse 5, Joshua told the people, "Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will perform miraculous deeds among you." And so Joshua instructs the people to consecrate themselves, right? To prepare themselves spiritually for this miraculous crossing that's going to happen. They're going to cross the Jordan River. And indeed they do that. Let's jump to verse 14. So when the people left their tents to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. When the ones carrying the Ark reached the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the Ark touched the surface of the water, the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest time. The water coming downstream towards them stopped flowing. It piled up far upstream at Adam. There was no water at all flowing to the sea of the Rift Valley. The people crossed the river opposite to Jericho. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan. All Israel crossed over on dry ground until the entire nation was on the other side. And just think about what an amazing sign and what amazing reassurance it is both for Joshua and for the people to see that they have also crossed another river in a miraculous way to enter into the promised land. And as they're crossing through the river, what are they also seeing but the priests of God holding up the Ark of the Covenant, a very real reminder for the people that God was there amongst them and with them. It's a reminder that God is involved in all that they are doing. And in verse 4 and in verse 14 it says this, "That day the Lord brought honor to Joshua before all of Israel. They respected him all his life, just as they had respected Moses." And so we see here that what God is also doing is he's trying to help solidify Joshua as a leader amongst the people. That the people would respect Joshua just as they had respected Moses before him. And so God has given Joshua some confidence with some words of reassurance. God has allowed this miracle to happen so that both the people can see and for Joshua himself to see. But one other thing that God gives Joshua is he gives him purification. Now, one thing that Joshua told the people was that they needed to consecrate themselves before the Lord. And so in essence what this means is that the people needed to be right with God. Now, let's remember that besides Joshua and Caleb, the generation of Israelites that's entered into the promised land is not the same as the one that had left Egypt. That generation had passed away in the wilderness, and now this is a new generation. And apparently one thing during their time in the wilderness that they had neglected to do was observe the Passover and also to perform circumcision. They had neglected some necessary things that the law of Moses had commanded. And then we go to Joshua chapter 5 and in verse 2, and it says this. Let's jump to Joshua 5 and in verse 2. And here, this is what it says. "At that time, the Lord told Joshua, 'Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites once again.' So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites." And then we go to verse 4. "This is why Joshua had to circumcise them. All the men old enough to fight when they left Egypt died on the way through the wilderness after they had left Egypt. Now all the men who were born were left circumcised, but all the sons born on the journey through the wilderness after they left Egypt were uncircumcised." Now this may seem like an extreme thing for the Israelites to perform, but this was a commandment that God had made and had established with the people of Israel. And as God had told Joshua at the very beginning, he said, "Do not waver from the law, nor to the left, nor to the right." And so this was something that they had to do. Circumcision was an act of consecration, a way of setting them apart. It was a reminder for them that they weren't like the other nations around them. That they listened to God and what he says to do. It was a way in that time for them to identify themselves as the Lord's people. And so let's read verses 8 to 9 now. "When all the men had been circumcised, they stayed there in the camp until they had healed. The Lord said to Joshua, 'Today I have taken away the disgrace of Egypt from you.' So that place is called Gilgal even to this day." Gilgal means to, in a sense, it's a bit of a play on words. It's a bit of saying to roll away. And so what's going on here? It's that Israel's bondage, the slavery that they had at the time of Exodus had stopped. That was finally removed now that they are safely on Canaan's land. In a way, it was as if God was saying that you have put all the things of Egypt behind you. You are now starting fresh. You are now starting the right way in the land of Canaan. And God is setting the Israelites right in with their covenant with Him. And no one had a right to mock God or His people now that God had completed His promise of leading them out of Egypt. During that time in the wilderness, perhaps there were many who would have mocked the Israelites. Oh, those are the wandering tribes in the wilderness. They've been there for 40 years, but now no one can mock them. Now, they also needed to be reminded, since this was a new generation, what are they even doing in this land in the first place? And once they yield, one of the things that the Israelites do is that they celebrate the Passover at Gilgal. And it says in verse 10, so the Israelites camped in Gilgal and celebrated the Passover in the evening of the 14th day of the month in the Rift Valley plains of Jericho. And also look what's interesting that happens in verse 12. The manna stopped appearing the day they ate some of the produce of the land. The Israelites never ate manna again. They ate from the produce of the land of Canaan that year. Things are finally being closed and finished. They're now in the promised land. And so they can enjoy the fruits of this land that God had promised them. But what is it that they do? They celebrate Passover. And this is a reminder to this new generation that God had delivered them out of Egypt. And reminding them that God has been faithful to them in the past, and God will continue to be faithful to them in this new promised land. So now they purified themselves before the Lord. They're in the promised land. God has given Joshua some confidence. He's given him some proof. And He's also purified these people. But there's one last thing that God needs to give them. That He needs Joshua and all the people of Israel to remember. If they want to start winning battles against the Canaanites, they first need to surrender. Now that might seem like a strange thing. Why is it that they need to surrender? God needs to conquer Israel. God gives Joshua present defeat for future victory. And let me explain what I mean here. Let's begin reading in Joshua chapter 5. Let's begin reading in verse 13. When Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him, holding a drawn sword. Joshua approached him and asked him, Are you on our side or allied with our enemies? He answered, Truly, I am the commander of the Lord's army. Now I have arrived. Joshua bowed down with his face to the ground and asked, What does my master want to say to his servant? The commander of the Lord's army answered Joshua, Remove your sandals from your feet, because the place where you stand is holy. Joshua did so. So as they're surveying Jericho, they see a man, a soldier of some sort. And Joshua goes up to this man and he asks him a question. Whose side are you on? Are you with us or are you against us? And given the circumstances of all that's going on, this is a fair question for Joshua to ask. But Joshua needs to understand this. It's not his side. It's not the Israelites' side. But the side that they need to be on, ultimately, is God's side. Now, Joshua being the leader, we would understand why this would be a fair question for Joshua to ask someone like the commander of the Lord's army. But what does this being say? In verse 14, truly, I am the commander of the Lord's army. Now I have arrived. The real question wasn't whether God supported Israel. God has been doing that for the past 40 years. He's doing it with Joshua. But whether this, is Israel going to be on God's side? So what does Joshua do before this being? He asks, well, what does my master require of me? So what does he tell Joshua? To remove your sandals, because the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. Now there's some theories as who is this mysterious being. Some people say that he was, some commentators and some ideas of who this might have been, is perhaps the angel of the Lord. Some manifestation of God himself. Regardless of who it was exactly, we see here that this is someone sent by the Lord to help Joshua understand. Before Israel could conquer anything else in the Promised Land, because what's going to happen is Israel could start going into the Promised Land, making all these conquests, and they can start feeling pretty good about themselves. But they had to understand that before all that was going to happen, they needed to have total submission before God. Now and only now is Joshua ready to conquer Jericho, knowing that he is on the Lord's side. The Israelites are going to win against Jericho, not by their power, not by Joshua's power, but by trusting in the power of God. So let's read. Let's read the story of Joshua, of the conquest of Jericho. Let's read verse 1. Now Jericho was shut tightly. I'm just mixing up my words today. You know what it is? It's because English is my second language, and so that's why it's happening. So I apologize for that. Verse 2. The Lord told Joshua, see, I am about to defeat Jericho for you, along with its king and its warriors. Have all the warriors march around the city one time. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, while the priests blow the horns. When you hear the signal from the ram's horn, have the whole army give a loud battle cry. Then the city wall will collapse, and the warriors should charge straight ahead. And you think even the way that God goes about the Israelites conquering the city of Jericho is just against what would have been thought in that time. Well, we need to build a siege ramp, and we need to do these different military and tactical things to conquer the city. And God tells them, don't do any of that stuff. This is what you need to be doing, marching around the city instead. And then when the walls come down, then, and only then, is when you go march into the city. But of course, Joshua is obedient, he is faithful to God, and so he does what God commands him to do. Verse 6. So Joshua, the son of Nun, summoned the priests and instructed them, pick up the Ark of the Covenant, and 7 priests must carry 7 ram's horns in front of the ark of the Lord. And he told the army, move ahead and march around the city with armed troops going ahead of the ark of the Lord. And so Joshua does what God commands him to do in this situation. And let's keep reading. When Joshua gave the army its order, the 7 priests carrying the 7 ram's horns before the Lord moved ahead and blew the horns as the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed behind. Armed troops marched ahead of the priests blowing the horns, while the rear guard followed along behind the ark blowing ram's horns. Now Joshua had instructed the army, do not give a battle cry or raise your voices. Say nothing until the day I tell you, give battle cry. Then give the battle cry. So Joshua made sure they marched the ark of the Lord around the city one time. Then they went back to the camp and spent the night there. And so we see Joshua, just how faithful he is. Again, remember, God had commanded him to be faithful to his words. And God is reminding the people, do exactly as God has commanded you to do. Verse 12. Bright and early the next morning, Joshua had the priests pick up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 ram's horns before the ark of the Lord marched along, blowing their horns. Armed troops marched ahead of them, while the rear guard followed along behind the ark of the Lord, blowing ram's horns. They marched around the city one time on the 2nd day, then returned to the camp. They did this 6 days in all. So we see that throughout this time, they've been faithful to obey what God has commanded them to do. And you think just how they would have had to have been faithful throughout 6 days in doing this. Perhaps the first day it's easy. Maybe even the 2nd day. But the 3rd day they start beginning to think, well, this is a bit unusual. But again, they continue to do this. They continue to place faith in the Lord. God is going to win the battle for them. Then verse 15. On the 7th day they went up at the crack of dawn and marched around the city as before, only this time they marched around it 7 times. Then we get to verse 16. The 7th time around the priests blew the ram's horns, and Joshua told the army, give the battle cry, for the Lord is handing the city over to you. The city and all that is in it must be set apart for the Lord. Now this is one great sign of Joshua's faith. Is what does Joshua tell them? To give out this cry. And he says, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. It's not, I have given you the city. It's not, we are about to take the city. But who is going to give them the city? It is God himself. Right from the start, we see who is really in charge of taking the land, of guiding the people, was the Lord. And we see throughout all of the story of Joshua up until this point, from Joshua's appointment as the successor to Moses, from the parting of the Jordan River, from God reaffirming this covenant that he had with the people through circumcision and Passover, and finally when he sees the command of the Lord's army. The conquest wasn't about the might of the Israelites, but it was the faith that they had on the one who could truly conquer the land for them. It was about God's power. Now Joshua was crucial because God had appointed him to be the leader behind all this. But ultimately Joshua understood that he was a servant of God. And God had called on Joshua to faithfully execute his instructions and lead the people. Chapter 6 and verse 20. The ram's horns sounded, and when the army heard the signal, they gave a loud battle cry. The wall collapsed, and the warriors charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. Everything has proceeded the way that God had promised it would happen if they were faithful to him. Because Joshua was a faithful man to the Lord. And throughout the book of Joshua, it's one thing that as you read it, and I encourage you to do so, is just to look at the faith that Joshua has as a man of God throughout all of his life. Through the time that he had with Moses, through this conquest of the promised land, and even to the end of Joshua's days. In Joshua chapter 24, all the way to the end, Joshua chapter 24, and in verses 29 to 31 in Joshua 24, it says this: After all this, Joshua the son of Nun, the Lord's servant, died at the age of 110. They buried him in his allotted territory in Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. Israel worshipped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime, and as long as the elderly men who outlived him remained alive. These men had experienced firsthand everything the Lord had done for Israel. And we see the kind of godly man that Joshua is, that throughout the time that he's alive and in his leadership, Israel is serving the Lord. And we see the legacy that Joshua leaves behind, and that the elders that live after Joshua, during the time that they are alive, Israel is also faithful to God. These had been men who had seen Moses, who had seen Joshua, who had witnessed the mighty deeds that had happened here. They had chosen to stand with God. And that choice to remember that God was behind their success, that what was most important was to be behind the Lord, to be on God's side, then they would prosper. And brothers and sisters, why is this story important for us? Because understanding that we need to be on the Lord's side is going to be the cornerstone for our success as well. When Joshua was one of the few faithful spies who said, no, we can take the promised land, he chose to fight because he had faith in God, even when that could have potentially cost him his life. In the situation with the golden calf, Joshua was faithful in that situation as well. Joshua chose to serve the Lord by being a servant to Moses. Joshua had chosen to believe God's promises about the promised land. Joshua chose to recognize the leadership of the captain of the Lord's army, choosing to surrender to God. And Joshua chose to take the leadership of Israel, and lead them into the land. He chose faith instead of unbelief. Joshua, in each and every moment of his life, chose God's side. And so we need to ask ourselves, whose side are you on? Or whose side are we on? And so this is my encouragement for us now and always, is that we must choose God's side. Because there's many sides that we can pick, many things that we can be dedicated to and focus all our time on. It can be sports teams, it can be our jobs, it can be politics. But remember, in all that we do in our life, we are choosing to be on God's, we must be choosing to be on God's side. that wish to serve the Lord. There is no other that will sustain us. No other who will guide us to the true promised land of heaven but God. And so my hope and my prayer for all of us always is, please let us look to the life of Joshua. Someone who didn't have undivided loyalties, but he chose God. And just think of the alternatives. If we choose other sides, if we choose the world, we will be like Jericho. And you think of Jericho and how puffed up and mighty they must have felt to be one of the strongest cities in the land of Canaan. And just how quickly they fell against the Lord. Only God will remain. I'm reminded of what Peter tells Jesus in John chapter 6 and verse 68. When Jesus, he sees many of his followers leave him. And Jesus looks to his apostles and he says, "Do you also want to leave?" And Peter says, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." And so, brothers and sisters, let us always have the answer of, whose side are we on? We are on the Lord's side. And if there is something that is taking us away from that loyalty, that we must remove it. And for each of us, that will be different. I would encourage all of you to be part of the winning team, as they might say. And I'd like to leave us with the words that Joshua, being an old man at this point in Joshua 24, that he speaks to the children of Israel the last time before he dies. And these are the parting words. And you think of what Joshua would choose to say to the people as he's about to pass and be with God. And he tells them in Joshua 24 and in verse 14, "Now obey the Lord and worship him with integrity and loyalty. Put aside the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt, and worship the Lord. If you have no desire to worship the Lord, then choose today whom you will worship. Whether it be the gods whom your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But I and my family will worship the Lord." And so, brothers and sisters, may we always choose the Lord. May we not follow the gods of this land, the gods of materialism and of selfishness, but may we be on the Lord's side. Now, there may be somebody here who has been lost in the wilderness of sin all your life. God is calling you to be part of his people. Or maybe you are a Christian and you have wandered away. God is calling you back. He wants you to return. He wants to bring you back home. And may my prayer always be that we are able to answer this question always: whose side are you on? And may we as God's people always say, the Lord's. If you need the prayers or the encouragement or anything from the congregation, we invite you now to please come forward as we stand and as we sing.